lovely to be here. It's very much amongst old friends. It's always a pleasure to be the Asia Society. This evening, I thought, here we are at the last weeks of the exhibition. It's been an extraordinary moment, I think, to bring the Belitung Tang Shipwreck highlights to Asia Society. It's an extraordinary discovery, one which has really, in many ways, been transformative in terms of our understanding of late first millennium international trade. We're talking of the Indian Ocean network that extended from Basra. We all know Basra as a military post serving Baghdad in the recent grim history of that region. It was a military base, of course, in the late first millennium as well, and a major international port, linked directly, surprisingly, all the way to South China. We had always taken the view that the trade system that spanned the longest known navigation route in history at that time, which was from the Persian Gulf to southern China, that this was conducted in staged journeys, and goods were transported, deposited in entrepôts, and then moved onwards in a series, in a chain of exchange. What's become evident from the discovery of the Belitung Tang Shipwreck is that whilst the former certainly happened, something else also happened. Vessels which travelled the entire journey from the Persian Gulf all the way to the major ports of late first millennium South China. This was a revelation and became clear when in 1998-99 the Belitung was discovered in shallow waters off Belitung Island, which is near Bangka in the West Java Sea, midway between Java and South Sumatra. And the site was identified, as is routinely the case, by fishermen. And they engaged in a certain amount of what we call cherry picking. We're only dealing with 20 meters of water here. They were diving, collecting items from the surface, and these were finding their way to the more famous antique streets of Jakarta, Jalan Surabaya being one of the most eminent ones. And within weeks of this process starting, I had people walking in my door at the V&A in London showing me pieces. They'd been FedExed over, obviously. If FedEx existed then, I guess it did, in '98. And these items were clearly of staggering quality and, more importantly, condition, such that I was quite skeptical. We all know what Changsha wares look like. I've seen many hundreds in archaeological context in Southeast Asia over the previous decades. I'd never seen anything in this condition. It must be a very skillful reproduction. Where's this coming from? I was proved wrong, of course. The cargo consisted of in excess of 60,000 artifacts recovered from the immediate vicinity of the largely disappeared and disintegrated ship's hull. That's not the entire composition of the cargo. There was clearly more material. Shard material remains on the floor of the floor bed of the seabed, and of course there were unquestionably other important commodities on the vessel which have entirely perished and gone without trace. And I signal that caveat very carefully because the commercial value of many of these cargoes may well have been embodied in silk textiles, which were a high-value commodity, also carried on vessels like this, and of course no trace remains after a millennium in the sea. So the evidence for that is entirely gone. The gap is simply a gap in our knowledge. So here we have a remarkable discovery. And what I want to do this evening is contextualize it for you a little. What was happening in the 8th and 9th centuries in the Indian Ocean world. It was a very dynamic period, and it has a long history that precedes it. Look at this, look at the exchange, some of the conversations that were going on, both in terms of technology and in terms of style, between the Persian Gulf world. I roll Iran and Iraq into one stylistic entity in this period, and what's happening in China. And of course, in China, we have to draw distinctions between the core of China, Han China, and the regions in the first millennium south of the Yangtze, which were still to varying degrees outside Han culture, the southern territories, and the ports which served the great international trade were to a large degree beyond the control of central China. This is a very important point. Guangdong, Fujian particularly, these were regions in the late first millennium that still were not fully integrated, just as Yunnan was not really fully integrated until the Yuan period, really very late in China's history. It was another world. This was the Yue world, which related culturally much more to North Tonkin, to northern Vietnam, and was looking southward and outwards, whereas the interior heartland of China, Han China, was looking north and northwest, and of course had been using the overland Silk Route for many, many centuries. What is often not appreciated is the Maritime Silk Route was also, well, can't quantify this. I was going to say equally important, but was certainly important as well, and played a very important part in China, extending its mercantile activity, but also its knowledge of foreign lands. And we have diplomatic contacts coming via the sea routes from the 2nd, 3rd century. These appear in the dynastic histories which have come down on the Chinese side. Almost no written record from the countries from where these embassies were dispatched. So the regions we're dealing with extend from the Persian Gulf. The Red Sea is also important, but that tends to be a slightly later phase of the story. The Red Sea trade operating to the west coast of India. Annual fleets were sailing from the region around Aden, and they of course linked up to Alexandria and the Mediterranean trade. So very important as well. But the long-distance trade, which is going really from Basra, the other great port is Basra in Iraq, and Siraf in Iran, on the northern coast of the shores of the Persian Gulf, were the two great ports which were engaged in the trade with the regions of the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, which the Chinese refer to as the Nanhai, the Southern Sea, and then these series of ports, Guangdong, Quanzhou, Ningbo, Hangzhou, and Yuanzhou. And each of these were heavily involved in international trade from an early period, but came to really galvanized in the 8th and 9th centuries. We see a commercial explosion taking place across Asia, which involves intense international maritime trade. And the reasons for this are not entirely clear. Much of it may have been internal to China and the demand from elites for exotic goods coming from Southeast Asia and West Asia. We have a growing demand from Buddhist institutions, temple establishments demanding aromatics, sandalwood and others in great quantities. So literally going up in smoke. But these commodities were very, very important in the dynamics of this trade. But the contact goes back much, much earlier. We have evidence for Indian traders operating in Southeast Asia from the early centuries BC now. We have inscribed ceramic pieces found in Southeast Asia and also in the peninsula region, but also in North Coast Bali, for example. Polished rouletted wares we know were produced on the southeast coast of India in the early centuries AD. There have been items found just in the last 5 years in the Thai Peninsula which give us the archaeological evidence for Indian trade contact back into the early centuries BC. So the story gets extended, and I'm sure as the archaeology continues and is more rigorous, the story will go back even further. One of the wonderful discoveries, a local discovery found in the southern Thai Peninsula, I show it here, it's found at a small place called Wat Klong, a small river estuary, which was clearly used by long-distance traders as a point of exchange. And in the last 20 years, the local abbot of the monastery there has instructed his community to gather up all the artifacts that keep being revealed in the banks of the river and by the fishermen and so on. And they've formed a remarkable museum of early trade items of coming from the Indian world into peninsular Thailand. And one of the items was a small touchstone used by a goldsmith in processing gold. We know that the Indians were hungry for gold, and this was one of the great motivations for their early contact with Southeast Asia. They gave the region the names Suvarna Dwipa, Suvarna Bhumi, the land or the islands of gold, and it wasn't simply the harvesting or the gathering of gold, but also the processing of gold, so adding value to that. So here we have a touchstone inscribed in early Tamil Brahmi, which identifies the owner, just put his name on it in graffiti, Paramal, the great goldsmith. So clearly resident there. And early 20th century photograph of goldsmiths working in Sumatra. I would wager that the gentleman in the middle was of Indian descent, and assisted by Malay assistants here. We know that Indians were very active in Sumatra, particularly sourcing alluvial gold. The earliest inscriptions in Sanskrit that survive in the whole region are from the east coast of Kalimantan of Borneo, probably 5th century. Why was anyone venturing to that remote part of the world? It was the alluvial gold coming out of those great river systems that cut right through the great landmass of Kalimantan. So they were going for the gold very early, and of course that's the whole story that we told in the Lost Kingdoms exhibition that I trust most of you saw. So trade was terribly important. I show you a 17th century mural from southern India because it epitomizes what's described in many of the earlier inscriptions from Sumatra. We have an 11th century Tamil inscription left by a merchant guild. They were organized. So the merchant guild was operating there. They had their head office in South India, branch office in Sumatra. They were sourcing alluvial gold. They were sourcing resins from the hinterland and the forests and so on. And the inscription dictates that you must pay your dues, your membership of the guild, in order to be entitled to trade, which is described as the privilege of sitting on the spread cloth, which is what we see here. And we see a couple of gentlemen engaged in what I think is gem trading. I think they're right, nice little garnet here or something like that in his little pouch of gemstones. So these people are involved in precisely this sort of activity. Buddhists were also important in this early trade. One of the key sites that we know of from the earliest geographies written about the region, which were generally written in Persian and then Arabic, was a site called Kala in the Arabic, which is almost certainly Kedah in Malaysia, directly opposite Penang Island. If you ever holidayed in Georgetown, you'll know it. And in what's today the rubber plantations established in the 19th century, a whole series of early Hindu and Buddhist temple complexes. Platforms for the most part, no surviving superstructures, almost certainly structures which had wooden and perishable material superstructure. Think of the temples of Bali today, where the lower structure is brickwork and the upper is timber and tile. That's probably what was happening here. Plenty of evidence of archaeological evidence, ceramics, glassware of contact with West Asia. And this very important stele, which was recovered in the 1830s and shipped off to India Museum, Calcutta, where I actually asked to see it in January this year, and they found it for me in their storerooms in beautiful condition. It's a marvelous piece. It records. It's a votive offered really for Thanksgiving for safe passage. Sea travel was extremely hazardous. We have a description in the 8th century, I think, of a fleet of, I think it's 35 Persian ships. Setting off from Sri Lanka probably for Srivijaya, for southern Sumatra, of which three arrived. So the risks were extremely high. It was perilous activity, but of course the profits were were monumental for those that survived. So this is a Thanksgiving stele by a Buddhist merchant operating in the region, undated. Paleographically, the script looks around 6th century, one of the earliest records of Buddhist activity in the region. Now, they were trading in high-end goods, but mostly in items which were being sourced from forests, from rivers, and so on. I mentioned the gold already was terribly important. The resins were important. But here we have, from two wrecks from the mid-10th century in the Java Sea, examples of large quantities of unprocessed precious materials, which were being shipped wholesale, if you like, to then be used to be refined and made and produced into high-quality, high-end objects. On the left is a large chunk of lapis lazuli, sourced almost certainly in Afghanistan. That's its primary historical source for this material. That piece would have filled a very large bucket. I mean, it was a large, I saw it in a plastic bin on the recovery vessel, a large chunk of lapis, and clearly it had been worked already. These are quarrying marks, if you like. They've been cutting out sections of lapis already, and this is being shipped to Central Java, almost certainly, where it would have been lovingly cut up and set into bronze images and used in jewelry and so on. And on this side, large pieces of unprocessed rock crystal. Again, so high-end trade in high-value commodities. Where does rock crystal come from? Well, many places, but one of the best-known sources historically for the Indian Ocean world is Madagascar. And who was trading to Madagascar? Who dominated the east coast of Indian trade? The Arab traders out of the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. They were operating all the way up and down that coast. Rock crystal, hardwoods. They did the hardwoods to build their dhows, their ships. The Arabian Peninsula had been deforested in antiquity. There were no timbers to be had. They sourced their hardwoods from East Coast Africa, and of course slaves. They supplied many slaves to India, and so on. The Arab traders were very important, as I mentioned, in China very early. We find them in Guangdong, in Canton. From the 5th, 6th century, we have this famous mosque that still survives today, which can be traced back to around the 8th century. And there are accounts of rebellions and so on at different points in the volatile history of the 8th and 9th century, which make very clear the populations were really very substantial. We're talking many thousands of residents. Quarters in Canton and the other coastal cities where foreign communities were quarantined. They lived, and in the case of the Arab communities, they were so large they lived under Islamic law. They weren't answerable to local law. So again, very powerful communities. This is the mosque, one of many mosques actually in Chonzhou in Fujian. This is Marco Polo's Zaton. Those of you who know your Marco Polo. This is the best surviving of the mosques. The whole dating a little later than our period, 10th, 12th centuries. Very, very important center for trade. This is the place that Ibn Battuta visited and reportedly Marco Polo visited. And from the harbour in Chonzhou, this very important shipwreck discovery, the first major shipwreck to be found in Chinese waters, in the harbour, swamped in the harbour, clearly on its homeward journey from Southeast Asia. The cargo had largely disintegrated, but embedded in the timbers and the bulkheads, they found traces of aromatic woods and resins and spices, all Southeast Asian products, which were being shipped back. So she was heavily loaded, caught in a storm in relatively shallow water. She was in the harbour of Chonzhou Bay, which is here. This is the location, and she's really just a little bit offshore. The vessel was recovered and is now in a small site museum. Most of the trade that was going on took place, however, in vessels which were locally belonged to a local shipbuilding tradition. The Chinese themselves were latecomers to the maritime story. Maybe they Who knows? China didn't really seem to concern itself with long-distance maritime activity till really quite late in its history. It only really takes off in the Song period, although it does begin before then, but on a real commercial scale. Before that, we're looking at riverine vessels, coastal vessels, but not long-distance trading. That was left to all these obliging foreigners who had come to China to engage in trade, to bring tribute, was often the euphemism for trade, and would bring exotic goods to China, which the elite would pay great sums of money for. This is the traditional Malay or Southeast Asian indigenous vessel, and it's a pegged and lashed. The planks are pegged with dowels, and then the internal system is braced under tension. This is some excavations of several of these boats that were excavated in very good condition, 10th, 11th century in Mindanao, in the northern parts of Mindanao, Butuan in the Philippines, some decade or so ago. So the diplomatic contacts that were going on were so important that when we look at a first millennium map of Southeast Asia, most of the names given to these places are Chinese names. We have, in many cases, no written record of what the local people called the place they lived in. All we have is the Chinese, either the name the Chinese gave it or the Chinese phonetic rendering of that name. And so here they are, Papan, Langkasuka, Dusan, and so it goes on and on. All of these places come from the Chinese sources, and our written records in Southeast Asia are, of course, extremely thin. But what we do find is that there was very active contact. There's this very famous hand scroll. It's incomplete. Has 12, as it survives, there are 12 foreign emissaries, envoys coming to the Liang court in the early 6th century to China. This is incomplete. The sections are lost, but it's a 6th century hand scroll copied again in I think it's in the 9th century, and this is the 9th century copy. The original doesn't survive. So we have 12 surviving images of foreign emissaries. 11 come from West Asia. Persians, Sogdians, all these sorts of people. One, this chap, bare-chested, wearing a lungi, is Southeast Asian. And we know where he comes from. The inscription tells us he comes from Langkasuka, right here. Patani, Songkhla, this sort of area, southern Thailand. That region is probably where he came from. So, or almost certainly where he came from. So we know they were sending emissaries and engaging in trade with China very actively by this time. And then this is in fact the first portrait of a Southeast Asian that exists. It preserved in this hand scroll. The big players in the trade, the Malays were important, but the big players were the Arabs. Those operating out of the Persian Gulf particularly. The whole nature of this trade in the 8th and 9th century, when it really builds up momentum, produces a whole literature. There's a whole series of navigational geographies written, how to get there and back, point-to-point instructions for navigators, and lots of stories, of course, that get embellished around that. And we all know the 1001 Nights and the Sinbad the Sailor stories, for example. These are the literary end of this same tradition. This is the time and place in which they're generated. Those stories come out of the bars of Basra when the sailors were on leave chatting to the geographers, because the geographers few of them travelled, some did, but most got their intelligence from the mariners. So you go down and sit in the bar and buy them a drink and find out how many days it takes to sail from X to Y. That's how you write your geographies and your manuals. And they sailed in vessels like this. The Arab dhow was renowned for being the least watertight of vessels. They leak terribly and take in water, but they're flexible. And we all know about high-rise buildings and tornadoes. The rigid building breaks, the flexible building survives. These boats can survive storms which most conventional rigid boats would break apart. They're stitched, remarkably, with coconut fiber, made into an incredible, unbelievably strong rope, and that's used to bind the boards together with a series of drilled holes. You see the stitching here, and on the stern, the lateral rudder here, the grapnel anchor suspended here. Sometimes these are in iron, sometimes they're in sections of stone with a wooden support. And of course, they've had a misadventure. The mainsail has broken. So this is a 13th century depiction of a very famous travel account written by al-Hariri in the early 12th century. Here's a later version of the same thing. This is a South Indian temple where our gem traders were, showing, and I should stress it's a Hindu temple, but the murals depict the commercial activity that brought wealth to that community. It's late Vijayanagar rulers, and what do they engage in? They engage in trade with there's the Indian merchant gem traders, and then you see the Arab horse traders. And we know they were very important in supplying cavalry to southern India, particularly. The Vijayanagar and Deccan sultanates all heavily relied on cavalry. They got their horses, for the most part, from Saudi Arabia. That's how they traveled. Now, the Arabs were there early, as I say, and the evidence is not so numerous, but it's there. If we know to look for it, we hear about these the Persian jars, the storage jars, and we have an account which just describes, I think, what we're looking at on the left-hand screen, an account of the ruler of one of the kingdoms in Champa in central Vietnam. He was a middleman in this long-distance trade, sending to China as tribute 20 Arab jars in 960 AD. And this is precisely the type of jar which was then recovered from the tomb of the local queen of the ruler of the kingdom of Min in Fujian in the 10th century. And this is one of the jars from her tomb. This jar was made in Basra or another kiln site we don't yet know in the Persian Gulf. Placed in the tomb of a small local ruler, but clearly seen as a prestige object. It's exotic, it's come from far away. It shows their power to attract trade and to generate wealth. And so 4 of these were placed in her tomb, which of course is conveniently dated. So we have these turquoise glazed earthenware jars, and of course we get this beginnings of the appearance of Abbasid coinage. The dinar begins to appear at the same time, circulating in the same trade system. Whole range of variations of these types of jars. This one on the left is one which was recovered in Luzon in the northern Philippines, which I saw about 20 years ago. Very, very important piece. Still remains in the Philippines. An example from the Persian Gulf now in the BM. If you try and look at the geographer's accounts and then look at the archaeological footprint, you can trace the trade routes very clearly with particularly the ceramic evidence. It wasn't the only commodity, but it's the one that survives for us and becomes a marker. So here we have the same blue glazed Persian Gulf storage jar from the estuary of the Indus in Pakistan. Okay, this is Arabian Sea territory. There it is again on the left, and just discovered in the last year in central Java a whole series of these jars identical. These are in the general region of Borobudur and Prambanan and so on. A new site has been found. Many sites, of course, disappeared under the lava flow at the end of the 10th century. That's how some of the great gold hoards have been discovered beneath the lava, 2 meters of lava. And this site, this small temple was found, and its associated godowns contained high-end ceramics from the Persian Gulf and China. There's small fragments here of the same type of wares together with Islamic glass. These are from Kedah in Malaysia. So as we look along the trade routes, we build a picture. There's a site in southern Thailand near Nakhon Si Thammarat. If any of you know Koh Samui, a famous holiday resort, you can see Koh Samui on a clear day from here. This is the beach at Lam Po, and it was clearly an important transshipment point for the long-distance trade in the 8th and 9th century. The beach at low tide, it's a very old slide. I took this 30 years ago. You walk along the beach at low tide, and you're stepping on Tang ceramics. They were clearly unloading the material, discarding what had been damaged in transit, just overboard, and the good stuff consigned then for the next stage of the journey. And the site has major Srivijayan temples. There's Wat Khao, which housed some very important Buddhist images, Mahayanist images, which are now in the National Museum, Bangkok. Still very substantial 9th century structure. And from this same site in the local museum, we have these ceramics. Now, you've all seen the show upstairs, downstairs, of course. So you'll recognize immediately the Guangdong storage jars with the little lug handles, monochrome greenwares, monochrome whitewares, the green splashed wares, the molded and fluted high-end whitewares, and so on. The recessed foot, B-foot type saucer dish. This is essentially the same profile that we see in the Tang Shipwreck. And here it is in fragmentary form from this major transshipment point in southern Thailand. So was the Belitung part of a much bigger trading system? Absolutely it was. This is also from the same site. And what are the 60,000 objects they recovered? 58 are changsha bowls, 2,000 are a mix of all the other things. And here we have a profusion of these changsha bowls. These are the sort of things I'd seen in the past. So when I was showing the pristine example in my office in London, I was skeptical, and I didn't believe it was real, and how wrong I was. So the Belitung has really changed everything, transformed our understanding of what international trade meant in the early 9th century. As many of you will be aware from the exhibition, the government of Oman donated a gift to the people of Singapore, a full-scale replica of the dhow, and it's big. And it's very deep. I was staggered when I went to see it. It had just finished its journey from Muscat to Singapore. So this is the first time I'd seen it out of the water. And it's incredibly deep. So it starts to make sense of how on earth would you fit 60,000 artifacts into one vessel. And you start to see decks, internal decking, which would allow this whole vessel to fill up. And of course, that provides ballast for safe passage. You can also see the construction and the stitching, and there's the model that was made as well. And it was remarkable because although it contained 95% was utilitarian ceramics, if you like, and a few elite ceramics, the cargo also contained unprecedented examples of precious metal objects, of pure gold objects and gilt silver objects, around 20, and some silver ingots, the first we'd ever seen of trade in precious metal bullion coming out of China. They're not marked, there are no markings, they're probably illegal because there were bans on the export of precious metals from China. Silver and gold were protected. Gold wasn't very plentiful anyway, and they had silver mines. But in the 9th century, these unmarked ingots, so you can wager they're not officially sanctioned trade, they're private trade and probably under-the-counter trade. And then in the mid-10th century, 120 years later, we get a whole series of silver ingots on these other shipwrecks which have official inscriptions. They're licensed to trade in silver by the government. So you can see how things changed in the course of a millennia, over a century. And I think the commercial pressures obliged the government to sanction the export of precious metals. But they didn't want to. That's why they promoted commodities you could regenerate just with human resources and natural resources. So, silkworms and weavers, and you've got silk, clay and potters, and you've got ceramics. They're infinitely renewable resources. Precious metals are not. So there was great pressure not to allow precious metals to leave China. And there were bans, edicts passed to make this illegal. And they got reissued on a fairly regular basis, which is, of course, a very good sign that they weren't being paid attention to. Solid gold hexagonal drinking cup, Sogdian design, with a little ring handle, and on each of the panels a separately cast depiction of a foreigner, a Western foreigner, entertainer, dancers, musicians, and so on. We know these exist in Iranian silverwork traditions. We have, I think, only 3 known examples in China. One from the Farmanshire Royal Relic Chamber, Chang'an. One from a hoard of gold found in Xi'an province, also from around the 9th century, but a miscellaneous collection of things, and this one. And this happens to be the largest, and if you care, it's the heaviest. So it's got the most gold of all 3. So it's a high-end object, and it remains a complete enigma to those of us who've worked on this cargo to understand who was it for? Was it diplomatic? Was it, who was going to be buying this sort of commodity? I mean, we have got examples of gold and silver objects clearly of Chinese origin, particularly Sung material, showing up in Java, for example, but they're not of this importance and this magnitude. This is an extraordinary object. So the temptation is to say, oh, this happens to be high-end diplomatic. This was destined for a ruler or something. Well, you can't rule it out. It is possible, but there's no sort of evidence to point to that. It was just very high-end merchants wanted to own things like this. And we know some of the Persian Gulf merchants were immensely rich. One shipbuilder, Ramesh, in the 11th century, funded as his own gift a whole body of textiles, Chinese textiles that he imported from his China trade to make a new cover for the Kaaba in Mecca. Now that's rather large, and these would be high-end silks. So this was a very valuable gift that he made, and would earn him great merit. And his tombstone has been identified, and it simply says Ramesh, the ship owner, or the mariner, or something. Very humble, very modest. But maybe he enjoyed gold beakers like this. You have in the exhibition these wonderful gold engraved offering dishes, superb quality. Of course, they didn't quite look like this when they were brought up from the seabed. They've had careful conservation work done on them. It's been very skillfully done to preserve the original patina and so on. Gilt silver is the most numerous. This is the base of a little covered box. It's rather this engraved and punched decoration is very typical of late Tang metalwork traditions. Very lively little creature. An object which was far too fragile to travel. This spectacular large pilgrim's flask. It's about 39 centimeters. It's really quite substantial. But in thin-bodied silver, and of course archaeological silver is very brittle, and so is prone to, unlike gold, which is quite robust, but silver breaks down. So this is a very fragile object. Bronze mirrors, a whole series of mirrors, some of the period and some are clearly recycled from centuries before. There are Middle Tang and even some earlier mirrors in the cargo. So they were just spare stock that was being shipped out. We don't know where they were going. A significant number of first millennium Chinese mirrors have been found in Vietnam, but they'd already passed that point. So who knows where they were destined for. And again, one of the enigmas in the cargo is this mirror, which is extremely special. Dr. Françoise Louis from the Bard Institute has provided the translation and worked on this material. It seems to be a very prestigious object, which was makes no sense that it would end up in being sent off to be traded. So we don't quite know the story behind this, but it's clearly a very important object, and dated 23rd December 758. But I'll say the bulk of the cargo were the ceramics, they mostly travelled like this, stacked and tied with rattan, I expect, and a bit of straw tucked around them to protect them, and they travel very well. But with being on the seabed for 1,000 years, and you have the abrasion of the sand, the movement of the water, and so on. So some not in pristine condition, but others were packed in storage jars. And this is very important because we have a whole range of types of ceramics which come from about 5 different kiln sites across China. Some seem to be sourced, they're all in the interior, so they're having to come down the river systems to the coast. So Yangzhou is important for the Guangxian kilns and the green splashed and the whitewares. Hangzhou, Ningbo, where Shanghai is today, important for the Changsha wares. And then these storage jars, which we know were made up the Pearl River system at Canton. So clearly these wares which were made in another place were then packed in Canton into these jars. So there's a whole staging of the assembly of the cargo was quite complex. Then from Guangdong, from Canton, they set off finally into the Nanhai, heading south. And the wares that were inside the jars, these are the ones that fooled me. The condition was, absolutely pristine because they were protected from all the stresses of being on the seabed. Also, spices being traded. This is star anise, Chinese product. These large storage jars, this is one of the Belitung ones, there were many. And I show you, some have little inscriptions, identifiers, often maybe just merchants or makers' marks, but some have what appears to be pseudo-Arabic inscribed into them. And it's not engraved later, it's cut into the wet clay. So at the point of manufacture, at the moment of when these things are made, these inscriptions were made. So clearly, Mr. Abdul Suleiman said, put in an order for 50 storage jars, and some little indication was put in Arabic on those jars to indicate they were his order. So these become important. More of the jars, and these are the new discoveries in central Java, a whole significant hoard of material. The Changsha bowls are extraordinary and rich in their decoration. Just show you a few examples. This one, this is a unique one on the entire cargo and important because we hear a date talked about for the cargo in the second quarter of the 9th century. That window is identified by virtue of this bowl. So it all hangs on this one item, one of 60,000 pieces, which has a regnal date inscribed on it, which the general consensus is converts to equivalent to 826 AD. So it's commercial cargo. It had to be assembled from a number of ports, but you're not going to leave your cargo sitting on the docks for years. You will ship it out as soon as you can get it all organized. So the probability that the ship sailed within a year or two or 2 or 3 years of this date is very high, in the late 820s. One example which actually has a depiction of it's probably a Chinese junk on here, being attacked by a mythical Makara, an Indian mythical hybrid creature, came into China with Buddhism. More examples, and I'll just show you from the Guy archive. These are photographs I took at Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka, further ago than I care to admit, somewhere in the 80s. Excavations around the great stupas at Anuradhapura in central Sri Lanka, and amongst the tens of thousands of local earthenware pottery, pieces of Changsha ware. John Carswell has done the excavations up near Jaffna at Mantai, which was the port that served the central plains of Sri Lanka and found similar material. These classic changsha storage jars with their moulded grape and leaf applique, little faceted spouts, very distinctive. Very important whitewares. These are ones that we now we had the science done about 5 years ago. We know definitively these are from the Guangxian kilns, producing this very utilitarian whiteware, and that becomes the body then for the green splashed wares and the remarkable cobalt decorated ones as well. Just a way in which this material can actually build a whole historical picture. Here we have a bowl found on the Belitung shipwreck on the left. We have a near identical fragment recovered, excavated from the harbour area of where the docks were in the first millennium in Yangzhou, 8th, 9th century. And we have this piece excavated by a team from the Met in 1937 in Nishapur, Iran. So here we have the same motif, the same bowl being produced in northern China, exported out of Yangzhou, the northern port, finding its way onto the Belitung shipwreck, and identical examples being excavated in West Asia. So just those three objects, you put them together and you've got a picture of how it worked, the whole trading system. More fragments here. These are from Samarra, which was a temporary 9th century capital in Iraq, replaced Baghdad for 80 years or something like this. Very important pieces covered early 20th century. There's a whole discussion, which I won't go into in detail tonight, but deals with the dialogue that was taking place between the Chinese wares in this period, represented by the Belitung, and the beginnings of glazed ceramics in the Persian Gulf. There's a whole ceramic tradition that starts around this time and is clearly in conversation with the Chinese wares. Which came first? There's just great discussion can go on about that, but it's clear, I think, it's a circular process. The green splashed wares are very important. There's a couple of hundred on the Belitung. They show up again. Here they are in Nara, the excavations of the 8th century Japanese capital. Here they are in China. And here we have the first example recorded from Myanmar. This is shown up amongst shard excavations at Bagan. Very important. So luxury goods were circulating around the whole region, and all the elites, be they in Bagan or be they in Nara or anywhere in between, understood that these were elite commodities and were having access to them. Here's a wonderful piece from the exhibition, and that's a kiln waster from the Guangxian kilns. And of course, the tour de force that you have in the exhibition, this extraordinary, slightly over 1 meter in height, spectacular. It's a bit like a yard of beer, isn't it? One of these great glass things. It's a wine ewer, but you don't use it, obviously. It's just your display piece for the mantle, but there it is, just an extraordinary item. But where does it come from? Of course, it comes from West Iranian metalwork. And we see very clearly here, this is almost certainly a Chinese copy of an Iranian import, probably in a precious metal. This ended up in the Hoyoji in Japan, in Nara. So traded at the time, 8th or 9th century. It's even got this sort of dragon head hinged cover as well, we see here, although this piece may not be necessarily belong with this object. And this particular one has winged horses, Pegasus, engraved around the design. So you have a circular process whereby West Asian metalwork, usually in precious metals, is finding its way to China, being then copied in ceramic, and then shipped back to the Middle East. It's a whole circular process. So this is part of the complexity of understanding the stylistic exchanges that are going on between the two regions. But it's clear one of the almost a signature mark of the ceramics in the cargo, particularly the green splash, but including others, is this grid pattern with palmette projections. And this is a motif which is not Chinese, but can be traced in early Iranian and Iraqi metalwork, and then has a afterlife in ceramics. So here is a detail of the great ewer. Again, that motif is here, and you can see how the handle and strap work here is, even the rivets are replicated. Clearly, it's a metal language they're using in the construction of this ceramic. Here is one of the great Chinese green splashed wares with the same pattern, excavated by the Germans in 1911-12 in Samara. It's now in Berlin. And here is the local Iraqi work that's clearly in conversation with this. Uses the same motif as we see engraved in this piece. Again, a combination of green splashed and cobalt blue here in this example. Now the cargo contained three what I call blue in white rather than blue and white. This, in one sense, it's the first blue and white in China, very important. People got wildly excited when these were found. They're on the Guangxian white wares. The cobalt's been added, but they couldn't control the technology. So when the cobalt was applied, it bleeds into the glazed body, and not a very particularly pleasing result. So the technique was largely abandoned until they developed higher firing techniques in the Yuan period and really refined blue and white as we know it. But this is the first excursion into blue and white production. And the first examples, of course, we've ever found in an export context. You can see the four little indentations that tell us it's Guangxian ware. A fragment of a ewer, there's the spout, same design. This is from the harbour, from the Tang period harbour of Yangzhou. The dish, the ewer, and this is the Persian response to that. Now, that's the story of the Belitung, but there's a postscript, depending on how much time we have, a few more minutes, to show you two more wrecks that have come to light since the Belitung was discovered. One is a wreck of a site. It was pillaged, was found by fishermen. It's never been archaeologically excavated, but it contains material contemporary with the Belitung. In Quang Ngai province in central Vietnam, just to show you this general location, it's going to be about here. And it has a sprinkling of the site is a problem. It's polluted with other shipwreck material. It's a dangerous piece of coastline, and so there are wrecks from many different periods, and the artifacts, of course, get all mixed up. So that contamination means that you can't really say anything very meaningful, but nonetheless, we do have Changsha material coming from this site. It's all been a local businessman took a benign interest in the wreck, and he bought all the material from the fishermen, including the timbers of the vessel, and has kept that and made it accessible to visiting researchers. So that's something better than, complete disaster. Figurines in three sort of sansai figurines, strings of bronze copper coins, all fused together. And a couple of coins have dates, which 8th and 9th century dates. But the wreck I want to finish on is this very exciting new discovery made in 2013, the Panom Surin wreck. It's in the Gulf of Thailand, right on the coast. And I'll skip over it fairly quickly because time is up. But it's located between the two great river systems, the Chao Phraya and the Tuban. These are the two river systems. One goes up here and one goes there. And it's really smack in the middle of these two in the mangrove delta region, which is why it survived in saturated landscape. The timbers, even the fibers of the binding cords for the boat are intact to a large degree. The local businessman was extending his prawn farm operations and leveled the land, and this is what he found. responsible Thai citizen notified the authorities. The site has been protected, and the farmer donated the land, the site to archaeology, and it's been worked very systematically by the Thai Fine Arts Department. The vessel's big. It's probably in the order of, the keelson is nearly 20 meters, so the vessel itself is probably 25 meters, something like this. That's a big vessel. You can see the stitching here, the original fibers surviving. This is the new recreation of the Belitung. You can see the same techniques. It's just a few of the field photographs of when this was being excavated in winter of 2014-15. This is one of the two masts. Both masts have been recovered. One has the sort of pulley fitting as well, still intact, still in working order seemingly, but almost no cargo. Essentially, the vessel was empty. It had less than 100 artifacts. So whatever it was carrying, it had done its business. It had traded its goods into central Thailand, lower central Thailand, and was swamped for what we don't know its fate. But it contained a sprinkling of ceramics, but they themselves tell us quite a lot. Unglazed jars we know from Guangdong, deer horn and elephant tusk, local commodities they've been buying in from local traders. Guangdong storage jars, local earthenware, there's a Mon pottery from the 8th, 9th century, and then very importantly, what we call in the trade the pointy-bottom amphora. Now, pointy-bottomed amphora are very important because these are really the signature storage jar of the Persian Gulf trade in the second half of the first millennium. And they really are very diagnostic. When you find them, you know you're in a trade situation with the Persian Gulf. They're scattered all the way down the east coast of Africa, down to Zanzibar, and we've never ever found them beyond Sri Lanka. This is the first ever discovery in Southeast Asia of these what's technically called a torpedo jar. They're amphora-like, but they don't have handles with these pointy bottoms. This is the Chinese ware, early type, I would think. This is from the Persian Gulf port of Surat, excavated from it was rubble put into the foundations of the mosque, which is first decade of the 9th century, so the ceramics predate that. So that's a pretty useful date. Here it is from the wreck site. Chinese inscription that just refers to a sort of storage warehouse of some sort. Persian Gulf wares, turquoise glazed, we've seen elsewhere. Here is the Belitung one on the right. This is the type of Persian Gulf material found from Thailand, central Thailand, Peninsula, and Japan, and the torpedo jars themselves are really quite spectacular. These are almost certainly, in my mind, the sort of jars when we hear about in the 1001 stories hiding in the great oil jars, the amphora. This is what they must have been hiding in. These are lined in earthenware vessels, very large, about 75 centimeters high, 40-45 wide. They're bitumen lined, painted with bitumen on the interior to make them so they're not porous. And you see it very clearly here, exterior, interior. And this is a recent find from another Persian Gulf site. And here we have the 6th century mural at Ajanta, Western India, showing it's a story of it's a Buddhist tale about a very virtuous merchant trading in sandalwood, interestingly. This gentleman, Purna, was a trader in sandalwood and made his fortune. Virtuous brother with evil, virtuous trader had very bad brothers. But the ship he travelled on, he has on the deck all of these open-necked vessels. The first depiction we have of these types of vessels. One of these torpedo jars, and I'll finish with this, has a chiseled inscription added later. And it's remarkable because after a lot of investigation, I was able to establish that it's inscribed in Middle Iranian. This is Pahlavi. This is the language of the Sasanians. But we know Pahlavi had a afterlife beyond the Sasanian period, use into the 8th and 9th, even 10th centuries. And it's been translated by a professor at Harvard. When I sent him the inscription, I got the reply within the hour. Very excited. And it's a proper name. And it's the name of a Zoroastrian merchant, because the ending to the name identifies him as a Zoroastrian. So it's a Persian of Zoroastrian faith who was using Pahlavi language, trading on an Arab dhow in the Persian Gulf in the late 8th, early 9th century. And to finish, in the course of these investigations, once we found this inscription and the full significance of it started to really become clear, I poked a little further, and what did I find? A garnet gemstone which was reliably recovered in Palembang. Palembang in South Sumatra is the site of Srivijaya, the great entrepot of the great interchange place for the East-West trade in the 8th and 9th century. And again, it's inscribed in Pahlavi. So we have very clear evidence now of Pahlavi-speaking merchants active in this long-distance trade from the Persian Gulf to South China. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that wonderful contextualization of the Belitung shipwreck and its cargo. I think we have time for just a few questions now. We'll start, I think the gentleman in the back was first here on the left-hand side.
You might have to help me because I hear badly.
Yes. If you could please wait for the microphone if you're going to ask a question.
Hello? Well, now it's on. Okay. On and off. Well, I have a loud voice, so I'll do what I can. Okay. The question, the Belitung, you didn't show any pictures of Sansai figurines and not even any pottery that I recall, though there was a Sansai in a later site that you showed. Is it just from the wrong part of China, or was it the luck of the draw, or was it just not shipped out?
Right. Thank you. Very good question. A lot of you will know about Sansai, the three-coloured wares of the Middle Tang period. And this was one of the great confusions. And I published about 5 years ago a rebuttal of the notion that Tang Sansai was the inspiration for West Asian splashed ceramics. Two problems. One, these wares were almost entirely funerary, so they were not trade goods. They were made for domestic consumption, principally to be put in tombs as inexpensive grave goods if you couldn't afford the precious metal stuff. And secondly, the time frame doesn't fit. You're in the sort of 7th, 8th century, not the 8th, 9th century. So when the Belitung material came on our radar, all of a sudden it clicked with the Persian Gulf material. This is what inspired the Persian Gulf material. This is the missing link in that story, which we didn't have the evidence for, because very little of this survives in China, because it was principally made as an export commodity. So, it's not going to be there. It's like Indian trade textiles in India. You don't find them. You find them in Southeast Asia, Japan, other places. They weren't ever collected by the elite. They were just trade goods, so they don't survive. So the same with the ceramics.
Next question right here on the left.
First of all, thank you for such a clear presentation. It's very fascinating. I'm wondering, because China started their maritime trade later than the other countries around, with Xi Jinping's new trade, One Belt, One Road, looking at your first map, I wondered how that differs from the trade route that you put up there in the current plans.
I need some help on that one.
She wants to know how Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road trade map differs from the one that you put up at the beginning. So the contemporary.
How does it differ from what in the exhibition? Or?
You're saying that you're asking how the Xi Jinping's contemporary conception of one belt, one road differs from this 9th century conception?
Because his route has been shown several times for the new Chinese maritime route. And I wondered if it's similar, including the same countries as the early 6th century.
Does his maritime route for the present and the future contain or include the same countries or the same regions that trade was active in during the 9th century?
Today.
Oh,
I mean, I think if you look at the way China is investing in countries extending all the way to Africa and everything in between, building an economic chain, then I think you get a pretty clear answer that those trade routes are still very alive and active. The deepest seaport being built currently in the Indian Ocean is entirely Chinese funded and controlled, and it's on the south coast of Sri Lanka. And it's causing a little concern to the government of India.
And Jean?
The shanks of bowls all seem to have a different brownish color that makes a frame for them. It's in quadrants. Could you talk about that? Where did the dye for that come from? What is that?
Okay, the Jiangsha bowls are the first. They represent one of several traditions in China in the early 9th century, it may go back slightly earlier, in which we see large-scale commercial, industrial-scale production. And this is really highly organized. This is big factory production. So they're producing tens of thousands of these items. And they clearly have a market for them, and there's a distribution system in place. I mean, this is serious business. So these bowls are being produced in great quantities and fairly mechanically. And those who were decorating them were given license just to be fairly creative. But the standard treatment after the central field was painted in various copper and iron oxides was then to dip the four sides into brown glaze. And you get these four framing devices, and that's a fairly standard design treatment. The whole thing about the Changsha wares, they come on stream, let's say, 800-ish, as far as we can tell, and they're only they peak in the course of the 9th century, but then they're out of fashion, so they're gone by the 10th century. That's done. They've moved on to other things. They're doing ever so tasteful monochrome wares. This is Winter of the Northern Song. It's a different aesthetic. So they don't have a long life. They're victims of fashion.
It's iron that's the coloring agent in that brown glaze. Iron. In the back on the left here. Oh, I'm sorry. To the right, and then you.
John, I was curious. What you showed basically is kind of part of the Chinese export porcelain, right? The Changsha ware. So, like the tapaki, the blue and white, seems to me it's a much higher quality type of China. Or was that also export? Because that's very similar to more like the Chinese imperial ware, like Shwenta and all that. So I'm just curious what happened there. Like tapaki has that wonderful blue and white.
Right.
It's a higher quality, different quality, right? It's also part of like export.
Right. The blue and white from the Belitung are only three. I mean, and you can count the number of blue and white from the 9th century on probably two hands maximum. Very few examples survive. There's a handful have come out of these excavations of the old go-down areas of Yangzhou, the 9th century, and not much else. And it was in terms of blue and white, it was a false start. they experimented with it. It clearly wasn't successful, and they couldn't control the cobalt. There's a bit of copper red being used in some of the changsha wares. That was abandoned. It's a very volatile agent in glazes. It's hard to control. So it wasn't really until they'd moved on in technological terms, probably in the course of the Southern Song, and then of course with the early Yuan, they were really at their peak, producing this magnificent cobalt decorated blues and the copper reds. That was a whole new chapter. So I wouldn't really even regard this as the beginnings of blue and white. It's technically different, and it was a false start. It didn't go anywhere.
So my question is the Tapaki one, is it of the same kind of export? That's my question.
No, it's not. It's not.
Guy, thank you very much. It's a good day. I learned something. My question has to do with one of your first slides of that tall vessel that you called turquoise in the color, and it certainly looked navy blue to me. Is there a reason that part of your industry calls it turquoise when it looks navy blue?
This is the Islamic pottery.
Yes.
Yes, so there's a range. These are glazed earthenwares. We know Basra has been identified as one of the major production centres. It probably wasn't the only one, but it's the one we know securely. And they range in colour, and some are turquoise, some are more sort of muddy purple. There's quite. It depends on the firing conditions or whatever. So yeah, there's quite a range of colours. But for convenience, they usually, in the archaeological literature, they're just referred to as the turquoise glazed stonewares, earthenwares.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question here in the front.
Thank you for a very fascinating talk. I find this all rather mind-boggling, but I'm very interested in the actual voyage and how they provisioned the ship. I mean, you have ships with 60,000 pieces of trade goods. How are you managing the crew? You're hugging the coast so they can reprovision fairly frequently. But do we know anything about these vessels and how they were managed?
Thank you. Interesting question. We know a certain amount, and one of the things which the 8th, 9th, 10th century Chinese sources mention explicitly is don't hug the coast. Because you're going to hit the rocks and the reefs. They stay out in the open waters. And the earliest Chinese description of the trade from South China, from Guangdong to the Persian Gulf, appears in print 30, 40 years before the Belitung ship sails. And it describes the points where they stop. So, yes, you make landings at various points. You'd stop in the islands off northern Vietnam, of Van Dom. You would stop off Hoi An, central Vietnam, at Chu Lao Cham. You would then head down the Vietnamese coast, then open water to the little island off the northern coast of Malaya, Pulau Tioman, and so on, and into Srivijaya. Probably hang out there for a few months because you would wait for the monsoon winds to change direction. That's when you do a few repairs on the vessel. When the timber analysis was done on some of these wrecks, hardwoods coming from the Belitung hardwoods are East African. But the deckings and the disposable timbers that get refurbished more often are a mixture of Southeast Asian tropical woods and Indian woods. So clearly they were renovating the boat at different points along the journey. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveller, 13th century or early 14th century, he provides an amazing piece of information, which is in describing the Arab dhow and what a resilient boat it was. He says, and of course the best coconut fibre cord for stitching the dhows comes from the Maldives, little islands off Sri Lanka, famed for holidays. And we supply this to Oman and to all the places that they're going to need it, and China, he says. Which means you've got a highly organized system of producing It's like Boeing producing aircraft and having all the component parts made in different parts of the world. You're having the coconut fiber cord made in the Maldives, shipping it to China to service their own boats there when they dock. That's organized, yeah? So this is impressive.
Can you add a little bit about the crews who...
Little bit of...
About the crew.
Oh, the crew. Well, what we did. What do we know about the crew? Not very much. There are a few little objects to do with activity. Some of the shipwrecks have, beetle nut accoutrements, things like this. To give you a bit of a clue, there was one Sumatran coin found, which is a bit of an enigma. It's a South Sumatran gold coin, presumably in the pocket of one of the crew or something. Yes, we don't know too much. I mean, grinding stones for preparing food, things like this. I should mention at this moment that there's a book has been prepared by the museum in Singapore, ACM, Asian Civilization Museum, which is about to appear.
No, it has indeed. It's appeared in the back.
Oh, it has appeared. Well, there we are. So by way of commercial, a new publication has come out. Am I allowed to say I recommend it?
Yes.
With a consortium of authors, contributors, of which I'm one, which present a series of essays on different aspects of the wreck. And that was something which the museum in Singapore had been planning for some time. And then when this exhibition was organised relatively quickly, this wasn't quite ready to function as a catalogue for the show, but it's here now. So for those with more than a passing interest, I'd recommend you put your names down for a copy of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and if you'd like a catalog, please do see Lauren in the back there. Again, I want to thank John Guy for presenting such a wonderful and lively talk to us this evening, and have a good night. Thank you. Thank you.